Rain hammered the sagging little house at the end of Maple Court like it had a grudge against the roof, running in wild rivers down the cracked windows and turning the front yard into a pool of black water where the street lamp's yellow light broke into shaking pieces. And inside, Martha Green sat at her kitchen table with a past due notice under her palm and a chipped mug of weak tea going cold, listening to the wind shove itself against the walls as if it wanted in, until a sudden, frantic pounding at the front door made the whole house jump and made her heart thud hard enough to hurt. For a second she stayed frozen in her chair, every warning she had ever heard about opening the door after dark humming in the back of her mind. Then the pounding came again, faster this time, and over the roar of rain she heard a thin, high voice crack with fear. Please open up. We need help. And that did something to her that 1,000 lectures about safety never could. She pushed herself up, the chair scraping against worn linoleum, and shuffled down the narrow hallway with one hand on the wall for balance, feeling the cold coming in under the door like a living thing. She pulled the curtain aside with stiff fingers and squinted through the street glass, and what she saw washed every thought of danger clean out of her head in one breath. A boy, no more than 8, stood on her sagging porch, soaked straight through, his sweatshirt plastered to his thin shoulders, bare feet in the torrent because his sneakers must have been swallowed by the ankle-deep water, and beside him leaned a man in a faded work jacket, taller but bent, his hand clamped on the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping him standing, his face flushed dark with fever, his lips pale at the edges and his breath coming in short, ragged gasps she could see, even through the sheets of rain. She unlocked the chain and pulled the door open. The wind slammed it wider with a wet slap, pushing cold into the warm, stale air. Please, the boy gasped, his teeth shaking in his head, his small arm thrown backward as he tried to hold his father's weight. My dad's real sick. We don't got anywhere else. The car died and, please, he can't breathe right. The man tried to speak, but a harsh cough tore out of him instead, doubling him over, and Martha smelled the hot, sour heat of a bad fever, saw the way his chest heaved like he was fighting invisible hands on his lungs, and in that instant her fear for herself lost the argument against what was left of her strength. Get in here, both of you, she said, her voice sharper than she meant, because sharp was all she had, and she stepped back, letting them stumble past her into the dim living room where the single space heater glowed like a small sun against the damp. Between her and the boy, they guided the man into the old brown armchair that had been her Henry's, the cushion sagging in the exact mold of a long-vanished body, and he collapsed into it with a low groan, one hand pressed to his chest. The boy hovered by his elbow, shuddering from the cold, his lips blue now that the wind wasn't whipping at them, and Martha moved by muscle memory. She turned the heater toward them, shoved it as close as she dared, grabbed the towel that always hung over the back of a kitchen chair and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders, then went to her bedroom and rummaged through a drawer until she found the flannel pajamas her grandson had left years ago when visits were still regular instead of just Christmas cards. Hey, she said, pressing them into the boy's hands. Bathroom's down the hall. Get out of those wet things before you turn into an icicle. And while he stumbled away on numb feet, she went to the bathroom cabinet herself and shook the fever pills into her palm, the last few rattling in the bottle like loose teeth. For a second she stared at them, thinking of the ache in her own knees, the pounding headaches that sometimes came when she lay awake and worried about bills, but the sight of the man fighting for breath in Henry's chair wiped away any thought of saving them for herself. She brought a cup of water to his lips, held the pills out, and when his shaking fingers couldn't quite manage, she guided them into his mouth and tipped the cup just enough for him to swallow. Easy now, she murmured, the same way she had once murmured to her husband when his heart acted up, the same way she had spoken to frightened children in church basements when their parents were in trouble, and she sat on the edge of the coffee table, watching the rise and fall of his chest as the boy came back in dry clothes 3 sizes too big, his wet ones rolled up in his arms like a surrendered flag. Rain hammered at the windows. The house creaked and sighed around them. Somewhere down the street a siren wailed and then faded away. Martha looked at the nearly empty soup pot on the stove, the past due notice on her table, the little pile of coins in the dish by the sink that represented all the cash she had left for the week, and then she looked at the way the boy's fingers clung to his father's sleeve and at the way the man's breath hitched and stuttered like a broken machine, and she knew another choice was coming that would cost her more than medicine and a clean towel. In the distance, deep beneath the roar of the storm and the noise in her own head, a different sound rolled through the wet streets of the city, the steady hum of a powerful engine moving slowly down a main road that had never had a reason to lead to Maple Court. And though she had no way of knowing it, that sound was already connected to the shivering boy, the gasping man, and the old woman sitting in the half-light, keeping watch on a stranger's life. The night that had brought them to her door had been building in quiet ways for a long time, in corners of the city where no cameras turned and no one sent reporters to ask how people were getting by. And if you followed the threads backward, you would find Martha long before this storm, moving through routines that were small on the outside but enormous on the inside. You would see her rising in the gray hour before dawn, her bones stiff as she swung her feet onto the cold floor, padding into the kitchen to set the kettle on and to line up her pill bottles, counting out the ones she could afford to take and the ones she would forget so that the money would stretch to someone else's need. You would see her step onto her porch, pulling her old wool coat tight around her, and walk the 4 blocks to the bus stop with a canvas bag on her arm, stopping halfway to leave a loaf of day-old bread from the bakery on the Reyes family stoop without knocking, because pride was a delicate thing and she had learned how to feed people without stepping on it. You would see her in the church basement every Sunday, ladling soup into chip bowls, her hands moving in an easy rhythm while her eyes watched the people more than the pot, keeping track of who came back for seconds, who seemed thinner this week than the last, whose shoulders sagged under news they hadn't said out loud yet. You would see her in the folding chair at the clinic, listening to the nurse scold her gently about her blood pressure while she nodded and made a mental list of the faces in the waiting room who might not understand the forms, the ones she would quietly approach afterward to see if they needed a ride or someone to sit with them. And you would see, in her memories, a younger version of her husband Henry standing in front of a small repair shop on a busier street, a cheerful sign over the door reading Green's Fix-It and his hands always stained with grease, waving people in even when their pockets were as empty as their busted radios and leaky kettles. No one who's lost gets turned away, he used to say when she worried over the thinness of their profit margins, when he accepted a bag of potatoes instead of cash or let someone pay him back in $10 installments over 6 months, and when the big grocery chain opened 2 blocks over and swallowed the foot traffic and the bank finally came for the shop. He said it again, his hand squeezing hers as they locked the door for the last time. After his heart gave out one winter and she found herself alone in the little house at the end of Maple Court, the rule didn't leave with him. It stayed in the way she left her porch light on until midnight, in the way she looked up from her tea whenever someone walked past, in the way her hand seemed to find the doorknob before her mind quite agreed whenever there was a hesitant knock. In another part of the city, not so many miles away, a man named Daniel was living by a different rule, the one the world had handed him. Keep going or sink. He took every job that came his way, up ladders and under sinks, in the rain and in the heat, telling his son Liam that as long as his hands worked and his back held, they would be all right. When the cough started, he ignored it, wrapping a scarf around his mouth and climbing the icy ladder anyway because the foreman had said this roof needed patching before the next storm and because the rent was due. The cold sank into his chest. The cough deepened. He woke at night gasping. But there was always another call, another job that couldn't be turned down. By the time he staggered into urgent care with Liam's hand in his, the doctor shook her head and told him he needed antibiotics and rest, but there was no line on the prescription where you could write 3 weeks of rent, and the company he worked for didn't pay men who weren't on the ladder. When he missed too many days, the calls stopped. The rent notice turned from a polite reminder into a sharp, ugly threat. And when he came home one afternoon to find their few belongings in garbage bags by the door, he did the only thing he could think of, packed what was left into the trunk of his old sedan and told Liam they were going to have an adventure. For a while they slept in parking lots and along quiet side streets, sharing fast food dinners and making up stories about the people in the passing headlights. But the cough kept chewing away at his lungs, and the car guzzled what little cash they had left. On the night the gauge dropped below empty and the engine gave a final shuddering sigh on a narrow road that had no gas stations in sight, Daniel pulled over, put his forehead on the steering wheel, and tried to breathe around the panic rising in his chest. "Sometimes," he said finally, turning to his son with a forced grin that didn't meet his eyes. "You just got to knock on a stranger's door and hope God moved in first." Liam looked out at the silent houses, most of them dark, their curtains closed tight, and nodded like this was a rule he could trust. Hours later, when the storm rolled in and turned the city into a blur of water and noise, he woke to the sound of his father wheezing, each breath a battle, and he panicked in a way he had never panicked before. He shook Daniel's shoulder, called his name, tried to pull him upright, felt the heat pouring off his skin. There were no lights out here. The car had died, the battery a silent lump. In the sheets of rain, the only glow he could see came from the end of the street, a weak, yellowish light from a porch that looked like it belonged to a house held together by paint and prayer. He didn't know it was Martha's house. He only knew he had been given a rule about doors and God and that this might be the last chance to test it. By 2 a.m, Martha's whole house smelled like damp clothes and fear, and the little clock above the stove ticked louder than the storm in her ears as she sat on the coffee table and watched the man's breathing grow more strained. The fever pills had taken a bit of the fire from his forehead, but his chest still worked hard for every breath, his ribs showing with each rise. His name, she had learned, was Daniel, and the boy was Liam, and they had been living in their car long enough that Liam said it like it was normal, like everybody knew what it was to lie awake counting the number of times their father coughed and wondering if he would still be there in the morning. Martha looked at them and saw pieces of 100 other faces she had known, bits and fragments of stories that had passed through church basements and clinic waiting rooms, and she knew exactly how the next part usually went if no one intervened. The slow spiral down, the quiet disappearance. Her hand went to the phone on the small table like it had a mind of its own, then pulled back, then went again. She knew what ambulances cost. She knew what bills did to people who were already hanging on by their fingernails. She had a stack of envelopes in her bedroom that proved she knew. But she also knew how long it took for lungs to drown from the inside, and she had no intention of sitting in this room and watching that happen because she was afraid of numbers on paper. "All right, Henry," she muttered under her breath, thinking of the man who would have already been dialing. "You win," and she picked up the phone and called for help. The dispatcher's questions were brisk and practiced. Martha answered them with the calm of someone who has had practice too, giving the address, explaining the symptoms, saying the words high fever and trouble breathing with enough force to make the woman on the other end say, "We're sending a unit now. Stay on the line if you can." And she stayed. The coiled cord stretched to its limit as she kept her eyes on Daniel's chest and her free hand on Liam's small fingers. When the siren finally cut through the storm, growing louder until the red and blue light splashed across her living room walls, she felt her shoulders sag in a way she wouldn't let Liam see. The paramedics came in with wet boots and efficient hands, asking questions, checking vitals, making faces at numbers that didn't look good, and they moved to wheel Daniel out the door like they had 1,000 patients before him. "Wait," Martha said, stepping in front of the stretcher. "We're coming to." One of them glanced down at her slippers and thin sweater, at the boy clinging to the side of the gurney. "There's not much room in the rig, in the waiting room," he began, but she cut him off with a look that used to stop her husband in his tracks when he was about to say something foolish. "I'm not letting this child sit in my living room wondering if his father is dead or alive," she said, her voice soft but edged with steel. "You find us a corner to stand in, or you can carry me along with him, because I'm not staying behind." The younger medic, the one who had looked at Daniel with real concern, nodded once and shifted aside. "We'll make room," he said, and that was that. The hospital was the same mix of bustle and boredom it always was at that hour. Bright lights making everything look tired, people in chairs slumped under blankets or jackets. The smell of disinfectant trying and failing to cover the scent of anxiety and old coffee. They rushed Daniel through double doors Martha couldn't follow, promising tests, oxygen, antibiotics, all the things that sounded expensive even when no one mentioned money. Martha and Liam were left in the waiting room, sitting side by side on a plastic chair whose metal frame dug into her back. After a while, a clerk came with a clipboard and a practiced expression. "We'll need someone to sign as the responsible party," she said, already scanning the form for blank lines. "Insurance information, address, contact," She trailed off as she realized she was looking at an old woman in worn clothes and a boy who couldn't have been more than 8. His father is the patient, she added, like maybe that would produce a wallet. He doesn't have insurance, Martha said. She explained, briefly, about the jobs, the car, the cough, how they had ended up on her porch. She could see the clerk's face tighten in the tiniest of ways. Well, we'll still need someone to sign, the woman said. But there was hesitation now, like she knew exactly what she was asking and didn't want to be the one to do it. Martha took the pen before she could talk herself out of it, her name shaking its way onto the line even as her mind raced through scenarios of collection agencies and lands. If she didn't sign, someone might decide they couldn't do as much. If she did, she might be inviting a disaster she couldn't pay off in 3 lifetimes. She signed anyway, because she couldn't bring herself to look at Liam and choose the alternative. The hours that followed blurred into one long stretch of bad coffee and worse chairs. Liam eventually sagged sideways, his head landing in her lap, and she draped her coat over him as a blanket, her hand resting on his back, counting his breaths as she had counted his father's. Nurses came and went. Someone mopped the floor. A television in the corner muttered about news she didn't care about. Once, she saw a doctor in scrubs talking quietly with a younger nurse who had brought Daniel in, their eyes flicking in her direction, and the nurse gave Martha the smallest nod, like a promise. When the doctor finally came to tell them that Daniel was stable, that they had him on oxygen and strong medicine, and that the next 2 days would be important, Martha felt her knees threaten to give way with the relief. They let her and Liam stand in the doorway of his room for a moment, just long enough for Liam to see the rise and fall of his father's chest, to hear the wheeze smoothing out under the hiss of oxygen, and then they guided the boy away gently, saying rest was important. Outside, the storm had quieted to a drizzle. Martha hailed a taxi, her mouth going dry when she heard the price and once again choosing yes where her bank account screamed no. On the ride back to Maple Court, the city slid past in streaks of gray and red, headlights smearing across wet pavement, and as they turned from a main road toward the familiar broken sidewalks of her block, a sleek black SUV glided past in the opposite lane, its tinted windows reflecting their beat-up cab like a ghost. Liam watched it go, his eyes following it until it turned the corner and vanished. That car looked like something from a movie, he murmured, half to himself, and Martha, tired and hollowed out, just nodded, not knowing that the same vehicle would be in front of her house by morning, parked not by accident but for her. Back home, the house felt smaller somehow, emptier with one less body filling it, even though it was still more crowded than it had been in years. Martha boiled water and made oatmeal from the last of the bag, dividing it into 2 bowls, thin but hot, and set one in front of Liam, who ate in quick, hungry spoonfuls until his face softened with warmth. She watched him and thought about the papers in her purse, the way the number at the top of the bill had looked when she glanced at it, big enough to feel like a joke if it hadn't been so coolly serious. Her name was under it now, a promise the hospital would not forget. She also thought about the fact that there was nowhere for this boy to go. There was no aunt waiting with a spare bedroom, no neighbor in another neighborhood, no system that she trusted not to chew him up and lose him somewhere between forms. She could give him back to the waiting room, to a stranger's care, and tell herself she'd done her part, or she could accept that he had knocked on her door and that she had opened it, and that doors like Hayes came with responsibilities no form could outline. "You'll stay here," she said suddenly, almost startling herself with the firmness of it. Liam looked up, oatmeal on his chin. "Until your dad's better," she added. "We'll work the rest out as we go." His eyes filled with tears. He tried to blink away, and he nodded quickly, unable to get words past the tightness in his throat. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The sky outside had shifted from black to a lighter, softer gray. The storm clouds were fraying at the edges. Somewhere not too far away, an engine turned over, a smooth, expensive sound, and began to roll toward Maple Court. It arrived less than an hour later, slipping down the ruined street like something that had taken a wrong turn out of a different world. Martha saw the black SUV through the thin curtain as she rinsed bowls in the sink, its paint catching the pearly light, its tires avoiding potholes out of habit rather than familiarity. Liam, perched at the table with a coloring book a neighbor had given him, heard it too and stiffened. "Who's that?" he whispered, as if the sound itself might answer. They watched as the vehicle slowed, stopped right in front of Martha's house, and idled, its engine purring. The driver's door opened first, and a man climbed out, mid-30s maybe, in a plain jacket and slacks that fit well enough to hint at money without shouting about it. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the door for the woman who followed. Early 40s, hair pulled back neatly, a doctor's posture even in a long, dark coat. She paused on the cracked sidewalk and looked up at the small house with its peeling paint, its crooked porch light, its fragile dignity. Then she walked up the steps and knocked. 3 measured raps that said exactly nothing about why she was there. Martha opened the door on the chain again, her heart hammering but her voice steady. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Ms. Green," the woman said. "My name is Dr. Elena Ruiz. We met, sort of, last night." Her smile was tired but kind. "I was the attending at Mercy General. This is Thomas Keller, from the Mercy Community Foundation." The man nodded, shifting the folder he held. "We're sorry to come by unannounced," Dr. Ruiz went on, "but we wanted to speak with you about Daniel and about some things that happened after you left." Liam had come to stand behind Martha, his hand pressed against the small of her back. "Is my dad okay?" he blurted before Martha could say anything. Dr. Ruiz's face softened further. "He's better," she said, and the way she said it made the air in the hallway easier to breathe. "Still very sick, but stable. The medicine is working. He asked us to make sure you knew." Martha's knees threatened to give, but she kept her back straight. "Thank you for telling us," she said, "but you didn't have to come all the way down here for that." Thomas cleared his throat, the paper in his folder whispering. "We came for another reason as well," he said. "If you're willing, could we come inside for a moment? It might be easier to talk at the table." Every instinct Martha had built over a lifetime of scam warnings and too-good-to-be-true offers flared up, but then she remembered the way the younger nurse had looked at her in the hospital, and she looked into Dr. Ruiz's eyes and saw not slickness or pity, but sincerity and exhaustion and something like respect. She chose to trust that. She shut the door, slid the chain off, opened it fully, and stepped back. "Wipe your feet," she said automatically as they crossed her threshold, because there were some lines you held no matter who was walking over them. In the cramped kitchen, they sat around the small table that had held more quiet decisions than any boardroom downtown, Martha at one end, Liam beside her, the visitors across from them. The folder lay between them like a question. Dr. Ruiz cradled the mug of coffee Martha had offered, her fingers absorbing its heat. "The nurse who was on duty last night told me about you," she said after a moment. "She told me how you stood at the desk and refused to move until someone took Daniel back, how you signed the forms without asking if anyone else could, how you stayed until we placed him in a room." Her mouth tugged at one corner. "She said you told her you'd haunt us if we let him die in a chair." Martha felt a flush creep up her neck. "Well, that's between me and my temper," she said. "I wasn't about to let that boy watch his father die waiting on paperwork." Thomas opened the folder and slid a sheet to the center of the table, turning it so that the printed lines faced Martha. Her eyes found the bolded words stamped across the top, "Paid in full," and then flicked to the number beneath, big enough to make her breath catch. The Mercy Community Foundation was created to help in exactly these situations, he explained. "We have donors who understand that one medical crisis can break a family. When Dr. Ruiz called me last night and told me there was a woman who had signed on for a bill like this for a man she'd met only hours before, we started the process immediately." He tapped the paper gently. "This bill is covered. Daniel's hospital stay, his tests, his medicine, and his initial follow-up appointments. You will not receive calls about this balance. No one will knock on your door asking for this money." The room seemed to tilt around her. For a long second, all Martha could do was stare at the paper, the words blurring. She hadn't let herself think about how she was going to pay it. She had only known she would try, somehow. Now, the weight she had quietly taken on in that bright hallway slipped off her shoulders, leaving her unsteady. "I didn't do it because I thought anyone would fix it for me," she said when she found her voice. "I did it because someone had to, and I was there." "We know," Dr. Ruiz said gently. "That's partly why we did more than just cover the bill. Thomas pulled out more papers, these ones filled with diagrams and notes. When we started this foundation, he said, we hope to create not just emergency funds, but lasting support structures in communities that have been overlooked. We've been trying to launch a pilot project in this part of the city for months. We had the funding, we had some volunteers, but we didn't have anyone on the ground to trust with it. We didn't have a center of gravity, you might say. He slid a simple blueprint across the table. Martha recognized the outline of the old brick building near the bus stop, the one with the boarded windows and the sagging awning. We'd like to lease this building and renovate it into a community resource center, he went on. A place where people can get a hot meal, basic health screenings, help with forms, a safe spot for kids after school. We need someone from this neighborhood to coordinate it. Someone people already know will open the door. We think that someone is you, Ms. Green. The words washed over her, strange and almost unbelievable. All her life, she had been the one at the bottom of forms, the one in line, the one calling the number on the flyer. The idea of being the person whose name went at the top of something, a job title, a center, anything, didn't fit easily into the shape of how she saw herself. You want to hire me? She asked slowly. To do what, exactly? To do what you already do, Dr. Ruiz said, her smile deepening. But with help. You'd organize meals, welcome people, connect them with the volunteers and services we provide. You'd help us understand what this neighborhood actually needs instead of what we think it needs from the outside. You'd have a salary, health coverage, and would include funds for repairs on your own house, because if you're the heart of this place, your home shouldn't be falling apart around you. Liam's eyes had gone wide, bouncing between the adults like he was watching a miracle happen in slow motion. Does that mean we can stay? He asked quietly. Me and my dad. Not in the car. Dr. Ruiz nodded, her expression firm. It means you'll have a safe place, she said. Either here, if that's what you and Ms. Green want, or in one of the small apartments we'll put above the center. But no more sleeping in cars. Martha still felt the urge to look for a catch, some small print where they would ask her to stand in front of cameras and smile while donors patted themselves on the back. Thomas seemed to sense it. We're not asking you to be a mascot, he said. We're asking you to be a leader. There will be meetings, yes. We'll ask your opinion on a lot of things. You'll have a say in who we bring in and how we run this. If at any point it feels like we're turning you into a picture on a brochure instead of a partner, I expect you to tell us. That made her huff out something like a laugh. Oh, I will, she said. Her gaze went to the small photograph on the shelf again. Henry standing in front of his shop, squinting into the sun. My husband used to say no one who's lost gets turned away, she murmured. We lost the shop, but I never forgot that part. She looked back at the papers. You're talking about a bigger door, is all. One I don't have to hold up alone. Dr. Ruiz nodded. Exactly. Martha's hand was still shaking when she picked up the pen, but this time the tremor came from the enormity of the hope on the table as much as from fear. Her name looked small next to the printed lines, but it carried the weight of every night she had opened a door instead of turning away. When she finished signing, Liam let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding and squeezed her arm. Outside, the engine of the black SUV clicked softly as it cooled, and neighbors peered through curtains, wondering what business such a car could possibly have on their street. The months that followed didn't tame Maple Court into a postcard, but they did change its shape. Work crews came in first, surprising everyone by parking their vans in the same cracked spots where old sedans had rusted for years, and by greeting the kids who gathered to watch instead of shooing them away. The boarded windows of the brick building came down, replaced with sturdy glass. A new door went in, wide and solid. Fresh paint covered the graffiti and the grime. Inside, walls were knocked down and patched up in new places, a kitchen installed where there had been dust. A small exam room built along the back wall. The smell of sawdust mixed with something else, the peculiar scent of plans becoming real. Martha went there every day, even when the noise gave her a headache, standing with Thomas and a handful of others over floor plans, pointing to where she thought the table should go, suggesting hooks near the door for coats, insisting there be a corner where kids could read or do homework without being underfoot in the main room. When the sign finally went up out front, Henry's house, lettering simple and strong. She ran her fingers over the carved wood and felt like she was touching her husband's hand. Opening day was not a glamorous event. There were no television cameras, just neighbors who had watched the building transform and wondered if it would really be for them. Martha stood at the door in a clean blouse and the nicest skirt she owned, her hair brushed smooth, her heart thudding like it had the night Liam first knocked. Daniel stood beside her, thinner than he used to be but upright, his lungs still working harder than most but no longer on the edge of collapse. Liam hovered near the table where stacks of bowls and spoons waited. Dr. Ruiz brought a tray of cookies, a volunteer nurse carried in a blood pressure cuff and a hopeful smile. Thomas lurked near the coffee urn, trying too hard not to look like he was checking boxes in his head. The first three visitors were shy, half apologetic, an elderly man whose hands shook when he tried to pour himself coffee, a young woman with a baby on her hip, a teenager with dark circles under his eyes who said he just wanted to see what this was. Martha greeted each of them like honored guests, and something about the way she did it, no fuss, no pity, just real attention, seemed to loosen their shoulders. Word spread a little more every day after that. People who had never set foot inside the church basement came to Henry's house because it didn't feel like charity. It felt like walking into somebody's kitchen, one big enough to hold them all. On a cold afternoon not long after the first light dusting of snow, Martha stood at the front window of Henry's house and watched Liam help an older woman carry her groceries up the stairs across the street, laughing as the bags bumped against his legs. Inside, the common room hummed. Two kids played a board game in the corner. Daniel sat at a table with another man, filling out a job application on one of the donated laptops. The nurse took a man's blood pressure and told him gently that he needed to cut back on salt. Martha's clipboard was filled with names and notes, but for the first time in a long time, her shoulders did not feel like they were bearing more than they could carry. The black SUV pulled up outside and she smiled when she saw it, not with the guarded curiosity of that first morning, but with recognition. Today it carried 2 volunteer doctors and a trunk full of winter coats donated by employees at the hospital. They came in through the front door, stamping snow from their shoes, and one of them called out, "Martha, where do you want these?" She pointed them toward the coat rack and watched as a little boy in a sweatshirt 2 sizes too small stared at the new jackets like they were treasure. Later, as twilight turned the world outside the windows a soft blue, she stepped out on the stoop to take a breath of sharp air. The street was still cracked and the houses still leaned a little, but there were more porch lights on than there used to be, and laughter floated from one end of the block to the other, thin but real. She hugged her cardigan close and was about to go back inside when she saw a figure at the far corner of the street. A woman pushing a stroller, her shoulders hunched against the cold, a small child walking beside her, holding onto the side of the stroller with one mittened hand. They stopped in front of one house, then another, the woman's head turning as if she was trying to decide whether to risk knocking. Martha watched for a long heartbeat, feeling a strange doubling in her chest, as if she were looking both at the present and at a memory. She saw Liam again in that boy's careful steps, saw Daniel's exhaustion in the set of the woman's shoulders, saw her own fear from that night reflected in their hesitation at the edge of a strange block. She went down the steps, her shoes scuffing the concrete, and walked toward them, her hands out in a gesture she hoped read as welcome, not threat. Up close, she could see the woman's eyes were red, her cheeks raw from wind and more than wind, and the little girl's nose was running, her face pinched with hunger and confusion. "Evening," Martha said gently. "You look like you've been walking a while." The woman let out a shaky laugh that had no humor in it. "Bus dropped us off," she said. "They told me, somebody at the shelter line said there's a place around here that might help. But I don't know the address, and I don't know if they were just being nice so I'd stop talking." The little girl pressed closer to her leg, looking up at Martha with wide, tired eyes. Martha turned slightly and pointed back at Henry's house, its windows glowing gold against the gathering dark, silhouettes moving in front of them like proof of life. "They weren't just being nice," she said. "You're standing right in front of it." The woman followed her gesture and frowned. That doesn't look like a shelter," she said. "It looks like somebody's home." Martha smiled, feeling something warm and fierce uncurl in her chest. "It started as one," she said. "Now it's a home with extra chairs." Come on in. There's hot soup and a place to sit, and we'll figure the rest out from there. The woman's eyes filled and overflowed, and for a second she couldn't move. Then she nodded, letting out a breath that sounded like something heavy being set down, and began pushing the stroller toward the door. Inside, the noise of conversation washed over them as she stepped over the threshold, not sure yet that she believed what she was seeing, a room full of people who looked like her and people who didn't, all sharing space without anyone at a microphone telling them who they were supposed to be grateful to. Martha held the door as they passed and glanced up at the sign out front, tracing the letters of Henry's name with her eyes. She thought of the night a storm had brought a lost boy and his sick father to her own smaller door, of the way her hand had shaken on the phone receiver and the way her signature had looked on the hospital form, of the morning when a black SUV had pulled up and turned all that private courage into something the whole neighborhood could lean on. She thought of how close she had come to saying no, to letting fear of bills and fear of strangers harden her heart. Funny things, doors, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else, as she closed Henry's house gently behind them. You never know, when you open one, how many lives are going to walk through after. The latch clicked into place with a soft, solid sound, and outside, the wind moved on down the street, leaving the little building at the end of Maple Court glowing like a lantern for anyone still out there in the dark, looking for a light that meant welcome.